So the story of my interest in mycotoxins is a little back-assward, as they say. So I think, as you all know, I went to the Dr. Bredesen's conference a few years ago, and as I said, kind of really fell in love with medicine again, really interpreting physiology and looking at diet and lifestyle and how it really interacted with physiology in a great way. And part of the presentation that we enjoyed that weekend at the Buck Institute was an afternoon about chronic inflammatory response syndrome, inhalational Alzheimer's, and mycotoxin illness. And I said, I definitely am not going there. I absolutely need to practice with somebody else who's going to learn this, because this is a completely new field of medicine for me, and I'm not sure I want to get into it. But, you know, life gives you what you need to learn, and so my patients have brought it to me. So we are going to talk about the case that Dr. Bredesen describes as inhalational Alzheimer's. He talks about 3 cases in his published article, but there's actually a lot more to mycotoxin illness than that. And this is the address of where I practice. I don't have any conflicts of interest. How we learn about this. You know, medicine is slow and stumbles over its advances reluctantly, the way I came to mycotoxin illness. And the way we came to understand this was really from a bunch of turkeys. You know, I don't like the look of these turkeys. So we're going to advance to the next slide, because that's my turkey. On the right, that's Daphne, who's flown out of the coop and can't figure out how to fly back in. It is true that turkeys aren't that smart, but she's a lot prettier than the ones we learned from. So in 1962, there was an epidemic in the turkey farms outside of London, and 100,000 young turkeys were afflicted and died, costing the agriculture industry in that tiny little area oodles of money, and nothing motivates science like financial loss. So the disease was prematurely named Turkey X disease because they didn't know what it was, but careful Sherlock Holmes work revealed that it was a mold contaminant of the Brazilian ground nut, contaminated with Aspergillus flavus, producing the mold toxin called aflatoxin, our first mold toxin, and probably the one, and certainly the one I learned about first when I became paleo. There was another reason not to eat peanuts, which I'd long known could contain aflatoxin, which raised my risk of breast cancer. So I'd been...
And liver cancer.
And liver cancer, DNA damage in particular with this mycotoxin. That initiated a period that in the nerdy world of mold studies is referred to as the mycotoxin gold rush. And now we're up to hundreds of mycotoxins that have been identified. And in the little space of time in which I've been working with it, the laboratories that test for mycotoxins have doubled the ones that they look for in people, realizing that there's clinical significance to a far greater number of them than we thought before. Mycotoxins have been around, though, and used unknowingly for hundreds of years. And the very first ones were in the 1300s, when they would take plague-ridden corpses and catapult them over the wall into the enemy grounds. We worried about mycotoxins in the Vietnam War, and we worried about mycotoxins. I don't know how many of you heard about the little drama that surrounded the suspicion of yellow rain. So after the Vietnam War, people in Cambodia and Laos thought that their enemies were continuing to assault them because there would be days when this yellow powder fell from the sky, made plants die, made people sick, got a lot of attention, and we thought it was, for a long time, in the United States actually, I think it was Andrew Haig, made a formal complaint to the powers that be on the other side saying, you have to stop doing this. And then they actually brought in some agricultural scientists who found out that in very warm weather, bees all leave the hive at the same time and lose about 20% of their body weight in the first hour of their flight when the ambient temperature reaches a certain level. And it was actually bee shit. It wasn't mycotoxins that were raining on those people. And actually, you know, much as Iraq didn't really have the weapons of mass destruction, they did have facilities that were researching mycotoxins. And we ourselves in this country have researched mycotoxins use in warfare. So a mycotoxin has the root in two parts of the word. Mycos means fungus. And so funguses are mold, and illnesses that come from funguses or mold are called mycoses. So athlete's foot is a mycosis. Coccidiomycosis is a mycosis. If the mold actually produces a toxin, that's when it becomes a mycotoxin. Going back to the athlete's foot, aspergillosis, coccidiomycosis, these mycoses are pathogenic in normal immune systems. So if we all went to work in a Central Californian agricultural facility and worked in the summer outside, a lot of us would get sick. Coccidiomycosis is indiscriminate. It kind of gets us all. Some of them are opportunistic. The ones we know the best are the ones that are generally pathogenic, and these are people acquire them through either inhaling them or eating them, and now some research or some suggestion that you can get them from touching them. So what the mycotoxin is, okay, so a mold is living somewhere in a nice, warm, moist environment, and it's happy, and it decides it's going to reproduce, and it reproduces more aggressively if it feels threatened. That's an important point to remember. It reproduces by sending out spores, and the spores have molecules that coat them, and the molecules on the spores are the toxins. They are the mycotoxins that give you mycotoxin or mycotoxicoses in the scientific jargon terminology for that kind of illness. So mold loves damp and warm. It reproduces by these spores, and the spores deliver the mycotoxins. It became a medical connection really in a fortuitous way. So Dr. Richie Shoemaker, who I believe has been on your podcast, has he not?
I'm sure he has, actually.
Oh, well, time to do it. He was working as a family doctor in the mid-1990s, and there was a terrible die-off of fish. See, it always starts with the animals in the Chesapeake Bay. And the fish showed, and the other reason this often starts with animals rather than people is we're interrupting a huge part of their life cycle if we suddenly make them sick for a week. If I make you sick for a week, it's a drop in the bucket of your life span. But for the fish, it could be when they're growing, when they're forming, they're much more likely to have a big impact on them. So there was a massive fish die-off, and at the same time, there were a lot of symptoms. People in the area who worked in the water, fishermen or people dealing with the water front in any way, were also getting sick, but it was such a hodgepodge of symptoms, it wasn't really so clear. But as they investigated the fish, they found out that it was a protozoan organism, flagella, that was releasing powerful toxins. So this is not mycotoxin, okay, but this is a transmitted toxin from these creatures. And the symptoms vary tremendously. So whereas in fish, they develop these recognizable lesions that could be so bad they would erode the surface of the fish, and they bleed or die. People, meanwhile, people who worked in the water were having this bizarre array of symptoms. Some person might say, I have a headache all the time. Somebody else is having trouble with their respiratory function. But luckily for us, there were a number of people who had really bad diarrhea. So one woman in particular had such bad diarrhea, and Dr. Shoemaker said, well, I know the one thing that will really stop really bad diarrhea, and that's cholestyramine. So he thought, this poor woman, she can't, go from room to room without having to run to the bathroom. Gave her cholestyramine, and he wanted to check back with her because, of course, you can have complications from taking cholestyramine. Wanted to make sure she was all right. And she said, it's like a week or two later, it's great. My bowels are under complete control. And I was able to, I've been going to work. And he says, well, you're going to work? She says, yeah, and I'm going back to the gym. I mean, I'm not sure what she said, but she said, I'm back to my whole life. All my other symptoms are gone as well. And he said, but I'm just treating your diarrhea. So something about the cholestyramine resolving the diarrhea that was plaguing her also resolved all these other symptoms. And he knew that the only, cholestyramine is a drug that, I've never used before dealing with mycotoxin illness. I think doctors used it to bring down cholesterol. Yes. Right, and I love cholesterol, so I've never tried to take it out of anybody, but it's a sticky resin that you have to take very carefully because whatever you eat in close proximity to it, food, supplements, medications, will be absorbed by the sticky resin that's in your gut. So whatever in your GI tract will adsorb onto the cholestyramine. But it also adsorbs bile that comes into the gut, and can even, it is thought, be a surface, so at the gut single cell interface between our gut and our circulatory system, perhaps even pull fat-soluble toxins out from the blood. But at the very least, it pulls fat-soluble toxins that have been dumped out of the liver in the bile and absorbs it under the cholestyramine. And as long as you can get that cholestyramine resin out of your body quickly enough, you will take out with it whatever was in the bile. Mycotoxin illness. I think of as we learned from that patient that the dinoflagellate toxin that she was ingesting, and now we know mold toxins in general, are completely variable from human to human, from one person to the other. And so, this list of symptoms that you've seen in your fibromyalgia, your chronic fatigue patients, that Dr. Bredesen saw in a lot of his cognitively impaired patients, general depletion and pains, that makes a lot of sense. A little more circuitous connection exists to contribute to sinus congestion and respiratory problems. One of the enzymes in the body that's really affected by mold is one of the ones that regulates our immune function in our lungs. And so asthma is a frequent manifestation of mold-related illness. And all these other symptoms that you can imagine, how something that is a toxin in the general body can cause these very recognizable but hard to put together and sometimes hard to diagnose and treat complaints. But I also want to point out that the mold illness also causes those symptoms for those patients that I've certainly been guilty of thinking, they're crazy. There's nothing that causes electric shock sensations in different parts of the body. And these are people who will also say that when they walk around the world, they create static electricity more easily than other people. They get a shock even when it's not dry, windy California weather. Ice pick-like pains are very characteristic. I can remember I've had patients who've told me they have a pulsation going up and down their spine. And, I can't think of anything neurosurgically or, anatomically that could give them the kind of complaints that they have. Put all together what Dr. Shoemaker came to discover, and he's now treated thousands of patients with some conflagration of these symptoms, is he's termed this collection of symptoms as a chronic inflammatory response syndrome that can come, and that's what I'm going to primarily talk about today, is from organisms, particularly mold, that grows in water-damaged buildings. It can also be transmitted, and many of these same conditions with abnormal lab tests and response to treatment in the similar way, from people who have Lyme and other tick-borne infections, another area in which I really didn't want to tread. So there is, I'm not going to be able to recreate all the names. There's an entrepreneur, and I'll send everybody out the link, and who believes that a mycotoxin a toxin from cyanobacteria, and maybe it was niacin depletion, causes Alzheimer's disease. So, over the last 6 months, we've found out that herpes causes Alzheimer's disease, and curing herpes will cause Alzheimer's disease. And, that lack of exercise, and if we just get everybody to exercise, it'll cure Alzheimer's disease. And now the latest one is cyanobacteria, and he's trying to get people to research on the mechanism of it and to understand it better. But it's in the news, and I'll try and remember to send you all that link. And then the dinoflagellates. So, dinoflagellates, if you weren't at the die-off in Chesapeake Bay, I have a patient who's been sick ever since she was in Central America, and she spent a lot of time swimming in mountain lakes, and I suspect that that's what she's got. Ciguatera has also been in the news recently. So these are all words that I would gloss over. Mass food production that requires mass food storage. So grains, from everything as obvious as grain silos to really the bulk food bins in Whole Foods. Food stores and food spoils, and we eat it without necessarily knowing it unless you're a particularly histamine-sensitive person. And something I didn't realize, but sheetrock hasn't been around here forever. If you built a house in 1940, you didn't put sheetrock on. What's sheetrock? It's pressed paper that has the ability to have water track in its interstitial layers. And in a proper environment, that's a great place to grow invisible mold. And then climate change expands the range of all these problems. Fungal growth is promoted by not only the spreading of warm, wet weather, but if you have seeds that are growing in a climate that is more plagued by drought and extreme temperatures than it were before, they put more of their toxins into their reproductive organs, the seeds. So about a year, 16 months after his first paper, where he took 10 patients and showed 9 of them improved on his protocol, he took 3 of them in particular and looked at the course and the nature of the treatment of these 3 people and dubbed them as having type 3 Alzheimer's disease. So in his current paradigm, he has 6 types, which he calls 5 types, because one of them is a mixture of type 1 and type 2. So type 1 is just an excessive inflammatory reactants like Bob had in his illness. Type 2 is wearing out of all the food that your brain likes to get, which is hormones and nutrients and different things like that. Type 3 is toxic, and it's getting to be a more prevalent feature among the general cases in the Alzheimer's community, and it's a little part of some of our more typical Alzheimer's cases, even if it's not a full-blown type 3. Type 4 is vascular dementia, and again, a lot of patients who you're seeing for some other cause of their dementia have, on their MRI, they say, oh, their hippocampus is fine, but they have evidence of small vessel vascular disease throughout, or actually even have amyloid angiopathy, which I don't think that's well enough understood its relation to ApoE4. But the people that are typically really qualify within not a mix of all the types, but type 3, tend to have a younger onset. So people who are young, who don't have the ApoE4 gene, have some history. So now it's a part of my history for all cognitive patients, but also when, somebody came in this week with migratory polyarticular inflammation, and so I asked her, have you ever lived in a water-damaged building? No, but she was a veterinarian, so she has exposures to different kinds of toxins. We go based on their symptoms. The complaints of type 3 Alzheimer's can sound the same when they first start talking about it. I'm not able to navigate my world anymore. I can't keep up with things. But if you actually ask them, it's not their memory so much it's a problem. It's their ability to organize their day, to say, I have 7 things to do today. I'm only going to do 2 of them. Which will it be? Or to keep track of things, and particularly to do anything with math. So somebody who's always been terrible at math, that's fine if they can't do, part of the cognitive test is start at 100 and subtract 7s going down. So they'll say, I've always had trouble with that. But if it's a new trouble for them. And then we do some pretty routine lab tests that insurance covers, and it will show up on the MRI. Because the MRI of somebody who has type 3 Alzheimer's will have a normal size of their hippocampus, the part of the brain that shrinks when you get Alzheimer's disease, but they will have they'll have a diffuse atrophy of another part of their brain, either gray matter or diffuse cortical atrophy, the surface of their brain, or they'll have evidence of a lot of inflammation. So these are people, as I said, who can't organize or follow through, complexity. There can be a mood change with it, as there is with a lot of Alzheimer's. And so when you give them this cognitive test, not only can they not subtract, it's so interesting to give this test to people. So the first thing that you do is they have I should have I was going to put a picture of it. A couple, circles that have A, B, C, D, E, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you tell people, I want you to connect them in order, alternating between numbers and letters. Like some people you can't even imagine can do it, whip through it, and other people that are talking as easily as we are today, to try. So when people are trying to talk their way out loud through doing a part of the test, I know they're not really passing it. The other part is draw the face of a clock with all the numbers and tell me what time it is. And their clock's really skewed. Or here's a picture of a rectangle, copy it in the space below the rectangle. So people who have trouble with that level of the MoCA test, then we get on to the memory, which could be remember these 5 words, or say this sentence after me exactly as I say it. The cat always hid under the couch when dogs were in the room. They have to get every word in the sentence right. They can't say the cat and the dog. They have to keep it all together. Those are the short-term memory deficits. So the MoCA is a test that any of us could do in 5 minutes, and some of my patients take up to 10. If they take longer than that, they don't get to pass it. It's as people start to fail, each part of the test does correlate with a different neuropsychiatric function. And so a real neuropsychologist would take them through more sophisticated tests, but it might be inspired in its focus by how they did on the MoCA. If I gave all of you the MoCA, all of you would do perfectly. So what we have high-performing people do. The problem with high-performing people is you have a very resilient brain. So if you're having trouble remembering serial 7s, your brain will just find neuroplasticity, an alternate pathway that will develop. So typically smarter people are identified by themselves and to their family members and by their doctor much farther along in the disease process and later in life than people who aren't so smart, who begin stumbling over little details in life quite young. So what I'd have all you do is there's an online test called CNS Vital Signs that looks at those different areas that the MoCA is quantifying separately. There's a memory, there's working memory, comprehensive memory, motor speed, how fast. I took the CNS Vital Signs with my office manager who's like 30, and we were just going through one copy of the test, so I'd do it for a little bit, she'd do it for a little bit, and we had this part where you have to tap your finger, and I thought, I'm doing really great at this. And then she took over for me, and just her age, she went twice as fast as I did. So I'm glad I wasn't taking the whole test after I saw that. So the very simple labs we do, and in retrospect, looking back, I've gone through a number of my patients over the years. So zinc, we'd ideally like for cognitive health for your zinc to be around 100, maybe a little higher, and for your copper to be around 100, maybe a little bit lower, that your zinc is higher than your copper. People with toxic 3 mycotoxin disease have zincs of 40, 50, and 60. Really low. So interesting, and can present as, well, I'll get to that. Your neurotransmitters, the hypothalamic pituitary axis is definitely affected by mycotoxin illness, and it will start as it first being stimulated, kind of like stress or sleep deprivation will do. You'll have your cortisol be up on the Dutch test and your cortisone be up, and if you did a blood test, both your ACTH and cortisol would be high, but after a while, they'll all start to fade, and particularly pregnenolone, and that's a difficult one to read because almost everybody past the age of 60 or 70 has has tanked their pregnenolone sometime in their life, and not everybody has recovered. I think mine was supposed to be around 30. I think mine was supposed to be around 100. I think mine was around 30. And this is also one of the settings where autoimmune illness, like antibodies to anti-cardiolipin antibodies or anti-gliadin antibodies, can be stimulated for a while, and if you heal someone's mycotoxin illness, they can reintroduce those foods. My favorite test for looking at some kind of toxic illness is the VCS test. And so this is a visual contrast sensitivity test, and you'll get something like this when you just go to your ophthalmologist's office. But this is an easy do-it-yourself test at home. Shoemaker has a test on his site, but on this freestanding site, vcstest.com, tell people to take this at home. They set themselves up. It tells you so many inches from your computer. You can't be needing cataract surgery or not have your glasses with you. And it looks at bars, black and white alternating bars, pointing up or to the right or the left, and you identify which direction they're pointing. And they get paler and paler and paler, and at some point you guess, and at some point...
It's a cool test, like yes, flying colors.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So many people failed in my office. They said, I have to take this test because I think it's, false positives everywhere, but I passed with flying colors too. And so it's free if you pass the test. So if you pass the test, it's in medical jargon. It says your test is negative. But I tell people that's good news. That means there were no findings in the test. And if it's positive, they have to buy the test. I think it's $10. And because then you get to see what parts, so you can have either so if somebody who's zinc, if I get somebody who isn't toxic, but their zinc is really low, their B12 is really low, their general nutritional status is terrible, they will fail the test, but in a different way than a mycotoxin patient will fail the test. They're different columns. I don't really know how they do this, but the idea is that they're reading different geographical parts of your retina, which of course reflect different parts of your brain. And the people with nutritional deficiencies fail certain columns, and the people with toxin illness fail other columns. I have an example of this test. These special labs, I don't think, well, maybe leptin. I don't think I'd ever ordered really any of them before I began doing mycotoxin illness. So the ones that I like the best are the first two because they are easy to order. Most insurances will pay for them. MMP9 is a zinc-based enzyme.
Matrix metalloproteinase.
9. And how we use it usefully in our body is to take away the extracellular matrix when we don't need it. So it's thought to be part of bone remodeling. But when it's too high, it starts disintegrating extracellular matrix that we need, like the blood-brain barrier. So a really high level of either MMP9 or TGF-beta1 is a good diagnostic suspicion that somebody has a leaky blood-brain barrier. Leptin is dysregulated, so in patients who have chronic obesity, no matter what they try, if they have any of these other conditions, now you want to start thinking about mold-related illness. The tests that we do, but if they were as helpful, I'm not so sure about these. So there's a genetic test. So, ApoE4 doubles your risk of Alzheimer's disease. It's not a death sentence, or, it can be worked with. This HLA test, so we do the HLA testing for antigens and antigen detection. The HLA-DRB-DQ test, it's difficult to analyze it. You run it through a little online calculator. And it predicts your susceptibility to some of these chronic illnesses. So 75% of people, when it comes to mold, have a good HLA-DRB-DQ test, and it should really only be 25% of people. So when you were saying people cough when they get in the presence of the red tide, that's an allergy, so that's not really what this is looking at. This is looking at whether your body can recognize this toxin, treat it as an antigen, produce an antibody, and get rid of it. I tell a joke to my patients, 3 people walk into a moldy bar. One person gets sick right away and they have to leave the bar and they go out. They're allergic. 2 of us are fine and we stay and have drinks. my immune system, or one immune system is recognizing it, slowly going to react to it, and over a day or two in the background, take care of whatever mold toxins I've inhaled. The other person doesn't feel like they're sick either, but their immune system's not recognizing it as a toxin, so they're slowly, over time, going to get sick. If we actually make that person well, their body will start acting more in a more extreme way when they are exposed to mold. So future mold exposures may be more palpable to them than their first. People may never really know when they got sick, but they say, well, I had a patient, I think it's ever since I lived in that wet place in San Francisco. She didn't have mold illness, but it would have been a suspicious factor. MSH and VIP, so vasoactive intestinal polypeptide and melanocyte stimulating hormone, are really important brain feeding molecules that get depleted in this illness, and they can both actually be replaced. As I said, the MRI is not a typical Alzheimer's picture. It's a different kind of deterioration. And then people who have high levels of MMP9, people who have mycotoxins, often have colonies in their nose, often asymptomatic, of multiple antibiotic-resistant colonies of nasal staph. It's not methicillin-resistant. It's not MRSA. It's a different kind of staph. And it seems to somehow, maybe just because of its biofilm, have a harmonious relationship with mycotoxins and brain inflammation. And so even if somebody, like I have a patient right now you'll hear about who's got nasal stuffiness, she likes her Marcons treated, but really it's kind of like, yes, the penicillin made my strep throat better, but we know we're giving it so they don't get rheumatic fever. I'm really treating her Marcons in the hopes that her mycotoxins will go down in her brain. So this is the visual contrast sensitivity test. And this is a really healthy person. So each dot, you can see each little circle has a flag going off it. That means that when they showed the patient this picture, which had high percentage of contrast, this was really black and white, and the line went off to the right, they guessed it correctly, they get a green dot. Up here, where it only had 2% contrast, and it was tilted to the left, they get a red dot because they didn't get it correctly. So everybody misses some of them. And if you do this test on a group of normals, the normal line is, the normal results are traced by the gray line. And this is somebody who has better than normal visual contrast tracking because it's tracked by your highest score. So if this person got this one right but missed these three down here, they'd get their score docked for it, but their tracing would stay the same. The nice thing about this is, like the organic acids test, it has a nice explanation with each test explaining how you would interpret each particular one. But they give you a nutritional score and a biotoxin score. And then the next test I do is a mycotoxin screen in the urine. There are 2 labs that do it, but I like to use Great Plains. So if you're pretty sick with mycotoxin illness, you're probably not doing a very good job of excreting it out of your body. So if I have a high level of suspicion, but someone is pretty debilitated, I want to do my best to optimize the identification of any mycotoxins they may have. So you're actually likely to boost excretion if they take glutathione for a week before they do the test, or they sauna and exercise really intensively in a couple hours before they do the test. And then they send their urine into Great Plains, and we get a result that is the type and the degree of mycotoxin. So this is about the most common one I get back, which is ochratoxin. Tells you all the things you need to know about ochratoxin, and what you want is a level that's down in here somewhere, or non-existent. I don't think I've ever, well, yeah, you've seen non-existent. I've seen non-existent. But a lot of people have it all the way up, and it says the exposure is primarily through contaminated foods, but It can also come from inhalation exposure in water-damaged buildings. And some of them will say one and not the other. And some of them have no real attribution for where they believe the source is coming from. But you'll get a report back. This report used to have 6 or 7 mycotoxins. Now they have about a dozen. This is the cheaper test than the other one. And they talk about things that can be used to eliminate that and that have been used historically. And then you also have to test your home for mycotoxins. So you can see something black and slimy growing there, but is it really the kind of mold that is a problem? So the EPA developed a relative moldiness index test that is like, you know, this is EPA, this isn't woo-woo Great Plains Labs, which I respect completely, but, you know, I think some doctors probably would not so much. And they rate the hazards of the mold and tell you what kinds of molds they are on a scale from -10 to 20, and you want it down close to 0. You can buy these cloths from Mycometrics, and each cloth is, I think, $100 or $200. So people who have, I know there's no mold in my home, I say, just get one cloth, do your bathroom, do the walls near your bathroom, and do anything near where there might have ever been a leak. And if it's positive, you're going to have to do 5 cloths to figure out where it is. Because mold remediation is a really big deal. Sometimes it's the lucky people who see the horrible black mold in their house. And the unlucky people who have some mold specialists detect things that they can't know if they find. This ERMI cloth is actually testing for dust, but it has corresponded well to mycotoxins having been present in that area. And then bulk food, and we're lucky because we don't let any of our patients eat grain anyway, but what comes up much more for us is coffee. And then the treatment plan is to remove from the exposures, and the principles of using binders to get these toxins out of the body. I want to give you an idea from looking at all of this, but if you're interested, I'll give you some resources that I think will help march you through it a little bit better. And then the question of whether to treat some of the abnormalities of these brain hormones. So do you treat ADH when it's really low by replacing it? Do you replace VIP? ADH is a simple replacement with a nasal spray that can be used kind of forever. VIP is probably more short-term because it's quite expensive and perishable. Something that's an advance since Dr. Shoemaker is to say, okay, Dr. Shoemaker used resins to get out all the toxins that are in the brain, and Dr. Neil Nathan and others have said, yeah, but what if there's actually the mold in the body, not just the mold toxins being produced by a mold that lives somewhere else, but what if there's actually mold in the body? So they go ahead and treat the nose and with nasal sprays and oral treatment, depending on what they suspect the mold is. And so there's amphotericin. A really important principle of treating for mold is that what you're trying to do is to get the body to excrete these mold toxins without mobilizing more than the body can excrete. So you wouldn't want to dump tons of mold toxins into the circulation and have them not be able to handle it. And it's reflected in how well the patient's tolerating the treatment. So you want to treat them as aggressively as possible without them feeling terrible from the treatment, because that means they're probably recirculating and reabsorbing the toxins rather than getting rid of them. So a low mold diet and enhancing excretion the way you would in any good detoxification protocol. There's a lot of curiosity about different kinds of saunas to use. Anyone have any experience with the infrared mat? So you can go to an infrared sauna place. You can get one in your house for like $1,500. A little wooden room. So if you've never taken an infrared sauna, you can sit in there for a long time. It doesn't get warm. The thought is, and I'm sure you can speak to it better than I can, the idea is that it penetrates to some deeper way, and people tolerate it better. And then they still do some sweating and excretion of the toxins.
It can get warm in there. I preheat mine.
Yes. Glutathione's important, and we give it in a whole bunch of different ways, from its precursors to people who are really sick. I don't have the capacity to do it, but intravenous, but nebulized is not hard to get. You know, people can buy a nebulizer off of Amazon, and your local compounding pharmacy can do that. After you sauna, when you are sweating, you want to shower off with clear, non-moisturized, non-fragrant soap, like Castile soap, to really get it off. That's kind of a separate line. So people who are generally in a detoxy mode might dry brush before their shower in the morning. So I had a patient who was, I assumed, a really classic Alzheimer's person. She's in her early 50s. She's ApoE3/4. She's had early loss of hormones from having breast cancer surgery and a hysterectomy. So she's been without her hormones. This is what's in my notes, and I'm just going to do my best to remember because I can't see them. Without her hormones for, you know, a long period of time, and she's, let's say 55. Maybe I have her age on this. I don't. I was pretty sure, you know, I felt pretty smug. Can't give her hormones, but I have good permission from her oncologist to give her pregnenolone. She'll be followed with that, and DHEA, and her B12 was terrible. Her homocysteine was high. Her dietary patterns had already been improved. She wasn't insulin resistant. And she did need help with stress and sleep. And after 3 months, she was no better. And, you know, okay. This is her. I'll go back and show you her picture. So she wasn't herself. She was unable to work. She brought her husband with her because she didn't think she could do the interview by herself. She couldn't sleep well. Surgical menopause at 48. Her thyroid needed boosting a little bit. For a smart, competent person, that's a failed MOCA at 25. She really, you know, been a business owner and manager, should have been better than that. Her hippocampus is 96% of its volume. Oh, well, I don't know what to make about that. And her zinc was 72, related to her copper of 108. So I did all my normal stuff with her, and when I saw her back 3 months later, she was no better. And certain things take a long time to repair. So if she were 75 and had been without her hormones for decades, I would have told her it takes at least 6 months for it to get better. But she was recent enough, and her diet had not been that bad. I really thought she should have been better. So I did this visual test on her, and if you can remember, the gray line is an optimal collection of healthy volunteers, and the red line is hers. And these are the columns that better correspond to nutritional deficiencies, and so this is still showing some, and so she was 2 steps below optimal, and then where she really falls off is in these last 3 columns, which have to do with mycotoxin illness, and particularly the 5th column is supposed to be a really great column to follow for improvements in biotoxin illness with treatment. Keep that in mind. So then we did her mycotoxin urine test, and she and her husband came in, and he came in, he goes, "Thank you so much. You know, my God, we tore out a wall in our basement where we are outside of our garage where we thought everything had been fixed. And when we took the wall off, it was just like horrible black mold." So, of course, she's forbidden from going in the basement. And they did home remediation. And so these are her eyes. So all I did with her, which is different what I would do now, is I gave her, I gave her a gentle binder to begin with, GI detox, which is bentonite clay and activated charcoal, had her work her way up. And then I gave her cholestyramine, and there are different ways to give cholestyramine, from compounded with no sweetener, where you add your own stevia, to compounded with stevia, to with NutraSweet, aspartame, or with sugar. And I think we just gave her the regular one. It was actually hard to get this test from her, and hard to really get her back in for any, well, those were her tests. So in July, we did these subsequent tests. Her VCS test was abnormal. That was the one I just showed you. She actually did have a really high MMP9. So the upper limits, according to Dr. Shoemaker, take it up to about 330. Hers was about twice normal. Some of the other numbers were okay. Her ochratoxin came back really markedly positive. So I've told them they weren't eating bulk foods, but they took care of what was in the mold. And the diet was no change, but she did the binders and the sauna. And, you know, like, but by December, I am calling her up saying, what is the problem? Why don't you come in? She says, well, I've been so busy being back at work that I just haven't had the time to keep up with you. And she said her improvement started within 1 to 2 weeks of taking the cholestyramine, which is really kind of unusual. So, but again, anything that's more recent is more rapidly reversed. So you start with 1 dose a day and you work your way up to 2 and then 3, and ideally you take 4. Most of my patients get up to 3. Some people can't take more than a half a dose every other day without getting an aggravation. So you give them the lowest dose, highest dose they can take without feeling worse. And that's when we got that better VCS test. Her zinc, as you can see, had come up some, but now her copper's gone up even higher. I'm not sure where she's getting her copper, but her VCS test was better. And now by the time she's come back, I said, okay, this isn't, you know, like start here and you go there and then you're all done, you're at the top of the mountain. This really is a mountain range we're going over, and there's going to be peaks and valleys. And I know some other binders we can use, particularly with ochratoxin, so let's use those for a while. And you know, I'm optimistic. She's obviously not cured, but it answers a lot of the questions. You know, this was never really Alzheimer's. She's at risk for it, but this was never really Alzheimer's. Patsy's a really sweet little old lady who's also brought in by her husband, and I've never seen her separate from her husband. And she came in over a year ago, and if you asked her, the only problem she had was that she had a burning tongue. Terrible burning tongue, and we could go through all these other things, but you know, her only problem was her burning tongue. Her husband reported that, you know, she was cold all the time, she was much more anxious and timid than she used to be, and she had a short-term memory of a flea, and she didn't do so well on her mocha, and she also had lots of things to fix. You know, her A1C was too high, her D was too low, she did not have the ApoE4 gene. So, you know, they were happy to hear that, and I don't think they still talk to everybody in their family. And her MRI, so a hippocampal volume of 32% is not great, but it's not bad. People can have normal brain functions down to a hippocampal volume of, so the percentile is compared to an age-matched group, and you can have really good cognitive function. It doesn't mean we don't want it to improve. It's not the percentage, it's related to a normogram. But her left hippocampus was smaller than her right, which is an asymmetric atrophy, is characteristic of Alzheimer's disease. But what the main reading in the MRI was lots of evidence of hyperintensity flare. I can't remember what the acronym FLAIR stands for. Bob, come on, you know all these things. Anyway, they said, you know, there's evidence of inflammation in her brain, and her zinc was really low. But again, I thought fixing all these things would fix her. So when she came back in April, no real change. Her burning tongue was still just as bad as it had ever been. And I asked, and he said, oh, well, they live in a retirement home in Eugene, and they used to live in a private home that had definite mold damage. In the midst of beginning to work with her, she fractured her hip. She had marked hyponatremia, which probably has something to do with her fracturing her hip. And on the testing first testing that we did, her ADH and osmolality were abnormal. She had not only, well, she had the same ochratoxin reading that the first patient did, but she also had these other, so she has 3 mycotoxins. And actually with a really low ADH, she could have had, and you can get, so you diurese, so you can get dehydrated and high sodium, but her osmolality was really high, so she had it sort of like going wrong in opposite directions. So the first thing I did for her was give her DDAVP nasal spray, which has really helped her nocturia, and it's fixed her hyponatremia. She had nasal marcon, so we treated that, and we treated her mycotoxins. This woman, like, she's so tiny. 2 of her would fit inside my body. She had no trouble with getting up to 3 or 4 cholestyramine a day. The first woman that I talked to you about really had a problem. It flared up her diverticulitis. She didn't care. I'll manage it any way you say. I want to go back on the cholestyramine, you know. So it really will affect your bowel function. Little Patsy had no trouble with it. We treated her nasal marcons with this bacitracin, EDTA, gentamicin nasal spray. She really likes it. And for the first time in November, she doesn't have a burning tongue anymore. And the thing that her husband sent me a little video clip. He said, I realized, I may not have told you, but I haven't seen Patsy at a party interacting with others in years, and I've forgotten how long. So he took me a little video in their home of them down in the social hour. So my parting words are to remember to suspect mold in anything atypical. And so if you're dealing with cognitive patients, it's people who are younger or don't have the ApoE4 and whose problem is more disorganization than being forgetful. But don't stop with cognitive patients. You know, as I've done this, I've thought, oh, that patient I've been trying all these years to fix blah-de-blah with, you know, I begin to think about it with them. So chronically inflamed in any way with a pattern that doesn't add up or looks like chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia. And to remember to ask about mold exposure, just as, of course, you inquire about all the other things in the world that can make them sick. Keep in mind that when somebody, you know, I can remember the patients that have told me those symptoms that did make me roll my eyes. And it could be, their symptoms could really come on with stress, and that makes sense with mold-related illness because of its effect on the HPA axis. There's really simple tests that anybody can do to begin to get an idea of if this could be one of the problems. It's important for people after treatment or for people whom you think this has been an issue to make sure they don't get re-exposed. So after treatment, and none of my patients are out of the woods yet with this, but say someone's really, actually I do it. So my very first mold toxin patient was a patient I treat down who's not a cognitive patient, but she's had kind of chronic fatigue for years, and she heard I was interested in mold. She says, I'm sure I've had mold. She failed the VCS. I did no testing. I just gave her cholestyramine, and she had a great response, and of course I wished I'd tested her. And so my instructions to her is you carry cholestyramine with you wherever you go. You will know in the future, once you've been treated for mold-related illness, your body will develop a better antibody-antigen response. You will have a more immediate inflammation. If we don't do anything, and Dr. Shoemaker's done this in some of his legal proceedings, I'll tell you a little bit about his book, which is great, but this guy wants to prove that it's his office that he works in that's making him sick for legal reasons. And Shoemaker says, okay, well, you know what you've got to do? You've got to go back to work, and we're going to draw labs every day for 3 days. And at the end of 3 days, we can start treating you. And numbers that would have crept slowly up at his initial exposure skyrocket in his subsequent exposures. But because it was in Portland, and Portland's not very good at this point, and at that point in reimbursing mold injury. So it didn't work, but he had great documentation of it being caused by that.
So refrigerated nuts, meaning it's a drier environment?
Right. Should be a drier environment unless, so warm, moist things make the mold grow, so it's drier and cooler.
Refrigerate or freeze your nuts?
Yeah. And so, you know, I mean, this is, you know, confession, freezer nuts. That went right over my head.
It went over mine too. It's another stressor.
What was I saying? I eat rice. But I won't buy rice in bulk anymore, you know, so people who are eating anything that, you know, who are not really paleo and eating anything that could be bulk, don't buy it in bulk and get locally roasted coffee. So the first reference is Dr. Bredeson's article that has 3 cases of it. For a really, I think actually Richie Shoemaker's book, Surviving Mold, is a wonderful introduction because he has a lot of case studies in it of people where oh, wow, it can show up in that way, and it's so interesting. And then his website is a great resource, but if you want to be walked through how to really think about it from somebody who is currently, but in a more progressive, comprehensive way at this point, Neil Nathan's book is good. ISEAI, the conference that I'm going to go to in May. And if you just want to be informed about mycotoxins in general, that's the clinical review, and that's it.